I read the letter at 2 in the morning, sitting at the same kitchen table where I used to do my drafting work when I was just starting out, 20 years ago, when I still believed that being the reliable one was a personality trait and not a trap. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, from my mother's neighbor, a 67-year-old retired librarian named Ruth who grew tomatoes and worried about her knees, and had, apparently, been watching my life from across a garden fence for 11 years without saying a word. Until now. The question she asked, near the bottom of page 2, was simple enough to fit in one sentence. In all the years you were taking care of your mother, how many times did she ask how you were doing and leave enough space for an honest answer? I put the letter down. I sat in the dark for a long time, then I picked it up and read the rest. And by the time I finished, I understood something that 2 decades of doing the right thing had somehow managed to hide from me. I had not been living inside a family. I had been operating a support system that called itself one. I'm telling you that because it matters to what comes next. I have spent my entire adult life building things that workspaces that hold people without anyone remembering who made them, and for a long time I did something very similar in my family. I built the structure that held everyone up, quietly, without a nameplate, and told myself that this was what love looked like when it was serious. 3 months after my mother died, a woman named Ruth, her neighbor for 11 years, a 67-year-old retired librarian who grows tomatoes in her backyard and worries about her knees, sent me a handwritten letter in a pale blue envelope. I left it unopened on my kitchen counter for 4 days. When I finally read it at 2 in the morning, sitting at the table where I used to do my drafting work when I was just starting out, I understood something that all the years of doing the right thing had somehow hidden from me. I had not been living inside a family. I had been operating a support system that called itself one. This is not a story about a wicked family. I want to be clear about that before anything else. The people in this story are not villains. They are something I find harder to talk about than villains. They are people who took what was offered without asking why it kept being offered. People who grew accustomed to an arrangement without examining it. People who confused my reliability for a feature of the landscape, the way you stop noticing a load-bearing wall until someone mentions removing it. This is a story about what happens when the person who has been holding everything together finally looks down at her hands and asks, "How long have I been doing this? And what did I think I was getting in return?" It's also a story about a letter, and a question a colleague asked me on a Tuesday afternoon that I wasn't prepared to answer. And it's a story about a conversation in a parking lot in the rain, 3 months after my mother's funeral, with my brother Declan, who had learned so thoroughly that I would handle everything that he had forgotten, if he ever knew, that handling everything had a cost. I need to tell you about my mother before I tell you anything else, because the story only makes sense if you understand what those years looked like from the inside. My mother, Catherine Callahan, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was 19 and Declan was 14. I want to be precise about what that timing meant. Declan was 14. He was still in school. He was young enough that every adult in the room could look at him and say, "He needs to be protected from this." And they were right. He did. I was 19. I was in my first year at the University of Oregon, on a partial scholarship I had worked extremely hard to get. I was old enough that the same adults could look at me and say, without saying it, "She can handle it." And I could. That was the problem. I could handle it, and I did. And no one ever asked whether I should have to do it alone. I came home that first semester as often as I could. Then more often than I could, technically, and still keep my grades. Then I transferred to Portland State to be closer. I told myself it was a practical decision. The program was good. The city suited me. There were real reasons, and I leaned on them hard enough that I didn't have to examine the other reason, which was simpler and harder to say out loud. My mother needed someone, and I was the one who knew how to be needed. My father had left when Declan was 4. Not dramatically. Not with a confrontation that would have made good story material. He just became gradually less present, until one day his absence was structural rather than temporary, and then it was permanent. And then it was something we didn't discuss at the dinner table, and then there was no dinner table because it was just the 3 of us, and then effectively just the 2 of us, me and my mother, because Declan needed to be shielded. I don't resent my father. I've thought about it, and the honest answer is that I resent him a little, in the way you resent weather impersonally, without any expectation that the resentment will accomplish anything. What I do carry is the fact that his departure established, very early, a dynamic that I accepted as the operating conditions of my family. Nora handles things. Declan is protected, not because anyone said this, not because it was decided in any meeting or stated in any policy. It was just the water we swam in. And fish don't generally question the water. My mother was not a cruel woman. I want to say that plainly. She was sick, and being sick for a long time does things to a person that aren't about character as much as they are about capacity. She needed help, and I was there, and the help I gave her was real help that made her life genuinely better. What I did not understand for a long time, what took me years to be able to hold clearly, was that being a good daughter to my mother and being invisible to my mother were not mutually exclusive. Both were happening, simultaneously, without contradiction. She was grateful for what I did. She also never fully saw me as a separate person with separate needs that might occasionally conflict with hers. The money started the way it always starts in these situations. Gradually, then categorically. In my late 20s, when I was established enough in my career to have a salary that felt substantial relative to hers, I began quietly supplementing her income. Not dramatically. Groceries here, a car repair there. The co-payment for a specialist who wasn't covered by her plan. Small things that any good daughter might do, and I was a good daughter, and so I did them. By 32, I was covering 50% of her rent. By 35, closer to 70. By the time she died at 69, I had been effectively paying her cost of living for almost a decade, structured around the understanding, never spoken, never examined, never agreed to in any formal sense that this was what family did. Declan, during this time, lived his life. Not badly, not irresponsibly in any way that announced itself. He worked at various things, a food truck for a while, then the brewery, then some period of figuring out what came after the brewery. He moved around the city. He was present for holidays when he made it. He visited our mother on birthdays and sometimes in between. He did not, to my knowledge, think of himself as someone who was not pulling his weight, because there was no visible scale. There was just Nora, handling things, the way Nora always had. And the arrangement was so well established by the time we were adults, that it no longer looked like an arrangement. It looked like personality, like the natural order. I am telling you all of this not to condemn Declan. I'm telling you because I think it matters to understand how these situations accumulate. No single decision was the problem. No single month when someone said, "Let Nora pay for this." It was decades of small deferrals, each of which was individually reasonable, collectively forming a structure that only one person was holding up. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from that kind of work. Not the exhaustion of difficult tasks, that kind is honest. It has edges. You can sleep it off. This is the exhaustion of tasks that are never finished, never acknowledged, and never examined, because examining them would require everyone to look at something they have agreed not to see. I didn't let myself feel that exhaustion for a long time. I was good at not feeling it. This is another thing that being useful from a young age teaches you, how to convert the energy of your own needs into the fuel of someone else's. It's not sustainable, but it works for a surprisingly long time before the bill arrives. The bill arrived in the form of a pale blue envelope, in the handwriting of a 67-year-old retired librarian who grew tomatoes and worried about her knees. My mother's funeral was small, the way she wanted it, or at least the way she had once mentioned wanting it, in a conversation I'd had with her 2 years before she died, when she was having a good day, and felt like planning things. Declan came. He stood beside me at the graveside with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, and I remember thinking, he looks lost. And then thinking, he is lost. He didn't know her the way I knew her. He wasn't there for most of it. That thought arrived and then I filed it away, in the place where I keep the things I'm not ready to look at directly. The weeks after the funeral were logistical. Closing accounts, forwarding mail, working with the attorney on the estate. My mother had not had much to leave behind. What she had divided between Declan and me, in equal shares. In a will she had written 8 years ago. The will said equal shares. What equal shares meant in practice was that Declan received half of an estate that I had been subsidizing for nearly a decade. Half of assets that existed because I had been paying her rent and her bills and her medical expenses, since before he had learned to manage his own. I understood this mathematically. I did not let myself feel it until later. The estate attorney was efficient and kind in the way that estate attorneys learn to be. He handed me a copy of the documents, offered his condolences, and shook my hand with both of his. I drove home along the river. I went back to work the following Monday. I designed a rain garden for a school in Northeast Portland and a small plaza for a credit union in Beaverton, and I did these things well, because I have always been able to do things well regardless of what else is happening inside me. Then Ruth's letter arrived. Ruth Okafor had lived next door to my mother for 11 years. I knew her the way you know people who are present at the edge of your important moments at holiday visits. At the time the heat went out in February, and my mother needed somewhere warm for 3 days. At the last few months when I was coming weekly and Ruth was often in the yard when I arrived or left. She was a small, precise woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and an opinion about everything related to container gardening that I found unexpectedly soothing. She had never been intrusive. She had simply been there, in the reliable way that certain neighbors are, witnessing without commentary. Her letter was 4 pages, handwritten in blue ink that ran slightly wider at the end of each line as if the pen were tiring. I left it on my kitchen counter for 4 days. I'm not certain why. Some instinct. I think the knowledge that whatever was in it would require me to make room for something I hadn't made room for yet. I had a project deadline. I had an HOA meeting for my building. I had reasons. The way people always have reasons when they are not yet ready to receive something true. I opened it at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, because I couldn't sleep and the envelope had started to feel like a presence in the room. Dear Nora, Ruth wrote. I don't know if this is my place. I've been trying to decide for 3 weeks whether to send this or put it in the recycling. I've decided to send it because I am 67 and I have learned that the things you decide not to say in order to be polite are usually the things that needed to be said. She wrote about my mother, about what she had observed over 11 years, from the vantage point of a shared fence and many cups of tea, about the way my mother lit up when Declan called, the way her voice changed, about the way she spoke about me with pride that sounded more like inventory than affection. Nora handles everything, she had told Ruth more than once. Nora always comes through. Not. Nora is remarkable. Not. I'm so grateful for Nora. Just the flat statement of capability, the way you might describe a reliable appliance. Ruth had seen me arrive every week in the last 2 years. She had seen me leave, sometimes late, sometimes clearly tired. She had noticed, once, that I sat in my car in the driveway for 12 minutes before driving away. I want to ask you something, Ruth wrote. And you don't have to answer it to me. You can answer it to yourself. In all the years you were taking care of your mother, how many times did she ask you how you were doing and mean it in the way that left space for an honest answer? I put the letter down. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, then I picked it up and read the rest. I also want you to know, Ruth wrote near the end, that what you did for her was real. It was good. It mattered, and I think you deserve to hear that from someone who watched it from the outside, because I'm not sure you heard it enough from the inside. She had signed it. Ruth, P.S. Your mother talked about your work sometimes, about the parks you designed. She didn't always know how to say it, but she was proud. I thought you should know that too, even if it arrived too late to do what you might have wanted it to do. I read that postscript 3 times. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I let myself cry, not the functional kind, not the kind you get through quickly because you have somewhere to be, but the slower kind that doesn't have an agenda. Outside my kitchen window, the garden I had helped design for my building was dark and wet in the Portland drizzle. I had never once sat in it. I went into work the next morning because I did not know what else to do with myself, and because I have always found drafting tables more navigable than grief. James Osei had the desk across from mine. We had worked together for 4 years. He was 38, methodical in a way that I found calming, and had the rare quality of being very perceptive without performing it. He noticed things and said nothing until the moment when saying something seemed useful. He looked at me when I walked in and said, "Rough night?" I said, "I got a letter from my mother's neighbor." He nodded. He went back to his drawings. He let me settle. Around 11, when I had been staring at the same drainage specification, I said yes. When is the last time someone asked what you needed and you actually answered honestly? I started to say something. Then I stopped. He wasn't asking rhetorically. He was waiting for an actual answer. I thought about it. The function of thinking about it, truly thinking, not deflecting, was that I couldn't come up with an example, not a recent one. Not one where I had answered honestly rather than with the version designed to reassure the asker that I was fine and didn't require anything. "I'm not sure," I said. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. I figured. He went back to his drawings. That was the whole conversation. 4 sentences. I sat with those 4 sentences for the rest of the day. I sat with them on the walk home along the river, where the leaves were beginning the slow, spectacular failure of autumn that Portland does better than anywhere else I've been. I sat with them while I made dinner, and while I ate it standing at the counter because I almost never sit at my kitchen table when I'm alone. Here's what I arrived at, somewhere around the 3rd block of that walk home. I had been answering a version of the question, "What do you need?" my entire adult life. But the version I had been answering was always nested inside someone else's question. My mother needed rent covered. What did Nora need to make that happen? Declan needed a loan. What could Nora arrange? The question had never, in my memory, floated freely. It had always been anchored to someone else's requirement. I had become so practiced at translating my resources into other people's needs that I had lost the ability or perhaps the permission to hold the question on its own terms. What do I need? I stood on the bridge over the Willamette and watched the water and tried to answer it. I needed to stop. Not from my job. Not from my life. From the arrangement that had quietly become the architecture of my adult existence. The one that ran on the operating system of, Nora is capable. Therefore Nora handles it. I also needed to understand something I had been avoiding. When my mother's estate was divided equally, half of an estate that I had been financing for a decade went to my brother, who had not been financing anything. That was not a malicious act on my mother's part. I believe she genuinely did not do the accounting. I believe she loved Declan in a particular way that made her unable to look clearly at what it was costing me to love her. But the accounting existed, whether she had done it or not. I had done it, in a spreadsheet. I kept on my personal laptop, not to prove anything to anyone, but because I am a person who measures things when they matter, and this had mattered for years. The total was not as large as some numbers in stories like this. It was $214,000. In transfers, in rent supplements, in the quiet rerouting of my financial stability into the maintenance of hers. $214,000 that had now been divided, by the logic of a will written before anyone examined the logic, into an estate shared equally between the person who had contributed it and the person who had not. I did not feel rage about this in the way people might expect. I felt the particular, slow grief of someone looking at a math problem they had been refusing to do for a long time and finally sitting down with a pencil. I want to tell you about the small moments before I tell you about the larger one. Because the small moments are where the actual damage happens, not in any single catastrophic event, but in the accumulation of thousands of tiny moments where you learn what your role in a family system is, and you learn to perform it so well that you stop being able to tell where the performance ends, and you begin. I was 23, and had just gotten my first real paycheck from my first real job, and I remember standing in the parking lot of my bank feeling something I can only describe as private joy, the specific pleasure of a thing you worked very hard for finally materializing. I called my mother to tell her. She said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Listen. While I have you, I'm a little short this month. Do you think you could?" I said yes before she finished the sentence. I am not telling this story to make her a villain. I am telling it because that moment, that particular yes, spoken before the question was complete, was the moment I can look back to and see most clearly. Not because it was the worst, but because it was the first clear one. The one where I can see, in retrospect, that I had already been trained to convert my good news into someone else's solution. Trained to understand that my resources were family resources, while the reverse was not true. I was 27 when I first understood that Declan was not going to become someone who handled things. Not because he was lazy. I want to be careful here because I've spent a long time trying to be accurate about my brother rather than merely angry at him. Declan is not a bad person. He is a person who was raised inside the same family system I was raised in. And the lesson that system taught him was simply different from the lesson it taught me. His lesson was, Nora will handle it. Mine was, I must handle it. We had both learned our lessons well. When I was 30, and our mother's condition had worsened enough that she needed a wheelchair ramp installed at the house, I coordinated the contractor, paid the deposit, and managed the project timeline during a week when I had 2 design presentations and a site visit in Seattle. Declan visited the weekend after it was finished and said, "This looks great." He meant it genuinely. He was not being ironic. He had simply never been in the conversation where decisions were made, because I had never put him in it, because I had never thought to, because this was what I did. Looking back, I can see the shape of it clearly. It's easier to see shapes from a distance. What I could not see clearly, from inside it, was this. The absence of Declan's contribution was not a gap that kept appearing. It was a gap that I kept filling, so consistently that it ceased to be visible as a gap. It just became the topography of our family, the terrain where Nora occupies this ground, and Declan occupies that ground, and the ground Nora occupies is slightly larger, slightly more load-bearing, and she is very good at making it look level. The grief that arrived after reading Ruth's letter was not grief about any single event. It was grief about a long time. It is a strange thing to mourn an arrangement rather than a person. But that is what I found myself doing, in the weeks after the letter. Mourning the version of my 20s and 30s that might have looked different if I had been able to say earlier, "This is not my responsibility alone." Mourning the savings account that would be more robust. mourning the version of rest and freedom and financial security that I had routed through someone else's stability instead of building for myself. And underneath all of it, the question I had the most trouble holding: did my mother love me? The answer I kept arriving at was not clean. It was something like, yes, in the way she was capable of, which was a way that consistently confused my capability with my needs, and consistently prioritized Declan's needs without examining the cost. That is not an accusation. It is a description. I spent a long time, after the letter, trying to separate those two things. I called Declan 6 weeks after the funeral, not because I had a plan, not because I had decided what I wanted to say, or what I wanted to accomplish. I called him because James's question had been sitting in my chest for weeks, and because Ruth's letter had said something I couldn't put back down. You deserve to hear that from someone who watched from the outside. I wanted Declan to have heard it from the inside. I had never told him what the inside looked like. We met at a coffee shop in Northeast Portland on a Tuesday, then moved to the parking lot because Declan wanted to smoke, and the overhang kept most of the rain off. He had his collar up against the cold. He looked like himself, slightly tired around the eyes, fundamentally at ease in a way that I have always found simultaneously comforting and, lately, clarifying. I had the pale blue envelope in my jacket pocket. I hadn't planned to show it to him, but I had brought it. I told him I wanted to talk about the estate. He nodded. He said he thought we probably should. He said he was sorry he hadn't brought it up himself. He seemed genuine about this. I told him what the total looked like. Not as an accusation, I was very deliberate about my tone, because the goal was not to wound him. The goal was to be seen clearly, perhaps for the first time, by the one person in my family who was still available to see me. I took out my phone and showed him the spreadsheet. The columns, the dates, the amounts, the categories. He looked at it for a long time. He scrolled up, then down. He didn't say anything. When he looked up, his expression was something I hadn't expected. Not defensiveness. Not the flat resistance of someone about to argue. Something that looked more like someone who has just been shown a map of a country they thought they knew. I didn't know it was this much, he said. I said, I know. Did you know, he said slowly, when you were doing it, that it was this much? I thought about it. Not all at once. I knew each piece. I don't think I let myself see the whole. He nodded. He looked at the cigarette in his hand. He didn't finish it. Nora, he said, why didn't you ever tell me to do more? And here is the thing about that question. The thing that made it the most honest moment between us in our entire adult lives. It was not a deflection. It was not an attempt to redistribute blame. It was a genuine question from a person who had been swimming in the same water I had been swimming in, learning the same lessons I had been learning, except his lesson was that the water held you up, and mine was that I was the water. I said, because I didn't know how to. Because by the time I was old enough to see the arrangement clearly, I was already so deep in it that asking you to change felt like complaining. And I'd never been allowed to complain. He was quiet for a while, then he said, that's not okay. What I'm describing is not okay. I should have asked, I should have offered, I should have seen. I didn't tell him he was forgiven. I wasn't there yet. Maybe I would be eventually. Maybe forgiveness would arrive the way Ruth's letter had when I was ready to receive it, not on a schedule someone else had set. But I told him the truth, which felt like enough for that day. I told him that I was going to change some things, that the financial arrangement, the informal, unexamined one that had calcified over 2 decades into the operating system of our family, was going to stop. Not with anger, not with punishment, just stop. Because I had spent long enough being the infrastructure and not enough time building a life inside it. He asked whether there was anything he could do. I thought about it for a long time. Yes, I said. You can start seeing it, not just today, going forward. You can be the person who asks how I am and waits for an honest answer. He said he would try. I believed him, more or less. Not because he had proven it yet, because the look on his face in that parking lot was the look of someone who has seen something he cannot unsee. Sometimes accountability begins there, not in repayment, not in grand gestures, but in the first moment of clear sight. Nothing dramatic happened after the parking lot conversation. I want to be honest about that, because I think honesty about this particular kind of healing matters. There was no confrontation that changed everything overnight. There was no family gathering where the truth arrived with thunder. There was no public reckoning where the people who had benefited from the arrangement were forced to face an audience. There was just me, making different decisions, one at a time, in the quiet of my own life. I closed the account I had used for transfers. Not dramatically, I just opened a new one and rerouted my direct deposit there. The old account, with its history of outgoing transfers and supplemented rent payments and emergency bridge loans that had never been bridged back, sat untouched until I decided what to do with it. I took the money I had been spending on my mother's cost of living, which, after her death, had freed up the last third of what I'd been carrying for a decade, and I did something I had never done deliberately before. I made a list of things I actually wanted, not needed in the functional sense, wanted. The list was embarrassing in its smallness. A comfortable armchair for the corner of my bedroom where I sometimes read, a long weekend somewhere I'd never been, alone, for no purpose other than being somewhere I'd never been, a savings account with a number in it that represented my future rather than a tax on someone else's present. I bought the armchair first. I sat in it the night it arrived and read for 2 hours and noticed that I kept waiting for something to interrupt me. Nothing did. James noticed the change before I could articulate it. He said I seemed like I was taking up slightly more space in meetings. He meant it as an observation, not a compliment. I took it as both. Ruth and I began corresponding. Real letters, on paper, in envelopes. Because she was from a generation that wrote letters, and I had discovered that receiving one was a different experience than receiving a text. She told me about her tomatoes, about her knee, about a book club that had just finished reading a novel she thought was overrated. I told her about the rain garden project, about the armchair, about the parking lot conversation with Declan. She wrote back, "Good. Don't mistake starting over for losing. Starting over is just starting with more information." I kept that in a small frame on my desk, next to the broken foam model of my first project, which I finally repaired. Not because it needed to be perfect, because leaving things broken, when you have the tools to fix them, is its own kind of habit. I want to tell you what happened with my brother, because I think it's the truest part of this story, and the part most likely to be left out. He didn't transform. I want to be clear about that. He didn't become a different person. He didn't call me every week with a checklist of the ways he was making amends. He didn't arrive with a check and an apology that tied everything up. He did some things that mattered. He called 2 weeks after the parking lot. Not because something was wrong. He called to tell me he had been thinking about what I'd said. He asked whether I had eaten dinner yet. When I said no, he said he was near my neighborhood and asked if he could bring food. He showed up 20 minutes later with Thai takeout and spent 3 hours at my kitchen table, and this time I sat down. We talked about our mother. Not about the money, but about her. About the things that had been true, that she had been funny, unexpectedly, with a dry wit that snuck up on you. That she had made the best chicken and rice I've ever eaten, and refused to write down the recipe because she said recipes were for people who couldn't cook from feel. That she had loved us both, in the particular and limiting way that she had been capable of. That conversation felt like the first honest one we'd had in years. Declan mentioned, toward the end of the evening, that he had looked at his own finances and was embarrassed by what he found. Not catastrophically, but enough. He asked whether I would be willing to look at them with him sometime and help him think through what he was missing. He said he didn't want to be 52 years old and still figuring out how money worked. I said yes. Not because I wanted to become his advisor or because helping him felt like my purpose, but because saying yes to that specific, bounded, reciprocal request, one where he was asking for my expertise for a defined purpose rather than my resources for an open-ended one, felt like a different kind of yes than the ones I'd been saying. He noticed that I charged him for the hour. He laughed. He paid. That might be the most useful thing either of us said to the other all year. My therapist's name is Dr. Sandra Patel. She has an office in a converted Victorian house in northwest Portland, where the heating system makes a sound in the first 10 minutes of each session that I have begun to find oddly comforting, like a house settling. About 5 months after Ruth's letter, she asked me a question I'd been circling around. "Do you think your mother knew what she was doing to you?" I sat with it. The answer I arrived at was no and yes. And the space between those two answers is where most of the grief lives. No, in the sense that I genuinely do not believe my mother sat down and decided to exploit me. She was not a calculating person. She was a person who needed things, who had learned that I would provide them, and who found it easier not to examine the arrangement too closely. That is not the same as malice, but it is not the same as innocence, either. Yes, in the sense that she was an adult who made choices, who called me instead of Declan when something needed to be fixed, every time, for decades. Who divided her estate equally between us without asking whether equality was the right framework given what each of us had contributed. Who said Nora handles everything as a compliment without ever asking whether I wanted to. The yes and the no coexist. I've stopped trying to resolve them. What I've landed on, after months of working through it, is this. My mother loved me in a way that consistently confused my capability with my needs. She loved me in a way that could not fully see me as separate from my function. That is a real love. It is also a limited one. And I spent most of my life trying to earn a more complete version of it through increasingly elaborate demonstrations of what I was capable of doing for her. That strategy does not work. I know that now. I knew it for years before I knew it. In the way you know things in your body before your mind is ready to agree. Here is the thing about being the useful one, the capable one, the one who handles it. The role is, in a specific and particular way, seductive. Not in an obvious way, not in the way that power or approval are obviously seductive, but in a quieter way. When you are needed, you are present. When you are present, you feel attached. When you feel attached, you feel loved, or something close enough to love that the distinction stops mattering. What I had to learn, very slowly, was that being indispensable and being loved are not the same relationship. You can be indispensable to people who do not see you. In fact, invisibility is sometimes a prerequisite. If they saw you fully as a separate person with separate needs and limits, and a life that existed outside of your function to them, they might have to think about the cost of what they were asking. Better, for them, not to look too carefully. I am not telling this story because I want sympathy. I'm telling it because I think this particular confusion, the one where being needed feels like being loved, is extremely common and almost never named directly. The question James asked me has become the question I ask myself now. As a practice. What do you need? Not, what does the situation require? Not, what would be most helpful here? Not, what can I do? Just, what do I need? I still find it difficult to answer. 4 decades of answering a different question leaves marks. But I'm getting better. The armchair helped. So did the savings account. So did charging my brother for an hour of financial advice. Sometimes the smallest assertion of your own reality is the beginning of something much larger. Ruth came to visit Portland in the spring. She said she had always wanted to see the Japanese garden, and her knees had been better since the cortisone shot, and there was no reason to wait any longer for the things you had always wanted to do. I took a half day from work and walked her through the garden. The maples were in full flush, the kind of green that looks almost too saturated to be real. Ruth moved slowly and deliberately, and commented on everything: the moss, the water feature, the way the paths curved to delay the sightlines. You designed things like this, she said, not as a question. Smaller. Community spaces, mostly. Schools, plazas, parks. Do you love it? I thought about it honestly. Yes. I think it's the way I understand belonging. You create a space, and it holds people. You don't have to be there for it to work. It works because it was designed well. She looked at me over her reading glasses, which were perched at the end of her nose even though we weren't reading anything. That's the nicest way I've ever heard someone describe choosing to matter quietly, she said. We had lunch after, at a noodle place I liked, and she told me about the tomatoes and the book club and her daughter in Minneapolis who was expecting a second child. She asked about Declan. I told her about the parking lot, the Thai food, the hour I'd charged him. She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that lifts slightly at the end. Good, she said. Charge him for next time too. I told her about the armchair, about the savings account, about the trip I was planning, just Portland to Ashland, a long weekend, alone, to see a play and walk in the hills and eat one very good meal by myself at a table with a book. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Do you know what I notice? You're not saying I want to do these things. You're saying I'm doing these things. Past tense for future plans." I hadn't noticed that. That's what people sound like, she said, when they've decided to actually live their life instead of preparing to live it. On the train home, I took the pale blue envelope out of my bag. I had been carrying it for months now. The paper had softened at the folds. Ruth's handwriting was visible through the envelope. I had thought, when I first received it, that it contained an indictment. A record of what had been taken from me and who had taken it. It contained something different. A witness. The particular comfort of being seen clearly by someone who had no obligation to see you at all, who chose to look anyway and then chose to say so. The train moved through the city. Outside the window, a small park I had not designed but knew well slid past benches, a play structure, a stretch of ornamental grasses bending in the late afternoon wind. Somewhere in there, some designer had made 1,000 small decisions about light and drainage and human scale, and the particular radius of a curve that makes a path feel like an invitation. I don't know who designed it. I don't think it matters. What matters is that it holds people. Every day, without needing anyone to remember its origin. There is a version of that, the holding without being remembered, that I used to think was enough. The quiet satisfaction of the useful life, the kept running, problem solved, reliably present contribution that family systems run on. I don't think it's enough anymore. Not because I want to be thanked for every transfer, every decision, every solved problem, but because the person solving the problems deserves to be seen as a person, not only as a solution. And the difference between those two things is not small. It is, in fact, the whole difference. If you are someone who has been called capable your entire life, if you are the one who handles it, the one who figures it out, the one everyone turns to when something needs solving, I want to ask you the question that was asked of me. When is the last time someone asked what you needed and you answered honestly? Not what the situation required, not what would be most efficient, not what a good daughter, good son, good sibling, good partner would do. What do you need? That question took me 4 decades to sit with. It took a retired librarian's letter, a colleague's 4-sentence conversation in a parking lot in the rain. You don't have to wait that long. Being needed is not the same as being loved. Being capable is not the same as being seen. And the arrangement that everyone in your family is comfortable with may be comfortable precisely because you have been absorbing the cost of its comfort. That is not love. That is an economy. And you are allowed to stop subsidizing it. Not with anger, not with performance, not with a moment that requires an audience. Just quietly, specifically, starting tonight. Ask yourself what you need. And then, and this is the part that will feel strangest at first, answer honestly. The rest follows from there, slowly, not dramatically, not all at once. But it follows. All characters and situations in this story are fictional, created for the purposes of storytelling, emotional reflection, and entertainment. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental. This story is intended to explore themes of family dynamics, invisible labor, and the difference between being needed and being loved.